Hi there, and welcome back to LeanReads, the channel where we share powerful insights and personal growth lessons through great books. Just a few decades ago, China was poor, closed, and forgotten. Today, it's the second largest economy in the world, and maybe the next superpower. But how did this happen? In Dealing with China, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson takes us inside the real story of risk, reform, and global change. If you enjoy what you hear and want to dive deeper, we've included a link to the book in the description below. Now, let's get started. In the late 1970s, China was still a mysterious name on the world's economic map, a closed and struggling nation recovering from years of turmoil. Yet, before the dawn of the new millennium, it had undergone one of the most astonishing transformations in modern history. Today, no one can deny that China stands as a global economic superpower, once even predicted to redefine the world order itself. So, how did this remarkable transformation happen? Dealing with China unveils the lessons, challenges, and opportunities behind China's extraordinary rise, offering an insider's look at the making of a modern powerhouse. Henry M. Paulson Jr., former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, brings a unique perspective shaped by decades of engagement with China. As chairman of the Paulson Institute, his mission has been to foster sustainable economic growth and strengthen U.S.-China relations, drawing on his first-hand experiences. Paulson provides an unparalleled view into the country's economic evolution, political mindset, and its growing influence on the global stage. This book analyzes how and why China achieved such rapid growth, and how that transformation has reshaped its relationship with the United States, politically, economically, and strategically. In just 3 decades, China rose from the ruins of poverty and war to become the world's second-largest economy, a feat unprecedented in human history. Through Dealing with China, Paulson condenses years of research and real-world diplomacy into a clear narrative that helps readers understand the role of privatization and reform in China's economic miracle, why the United States should cooperate with China rather than isolate it, how China learned from its rivals, even from the U.S. itself, to rise to power. China's astonishing economic rise, the power of deep reform. China's extraordinary growth story is not a miracle born of chance, but the result of bold and far-reaching reforms. In the late 1970s, if you had told anyone that China would become an economic powerhouse, few would have believed you. Yet today, that impossible prediction has become reality. China now stands among the world's largest and fastest-growing economies. But what made such a transformation possible? It all began with learning from the West after the death of Chairman Mao Zedong in 1976. Deng Xiaoping rose to power and launched a sweeping program of economic reform. Over the next 2 years, he introduced new market-oriented initiatives that opened China to the world and reconnected it to global trade. The results were astonishing. Within a few years, hundreds of millions of Chinese people escaped poverty. By the early 1980s, China's GDP was growing at an impressive 10% per year, laying the foundation for decades of prosperity. Concrete policies that changed everything at the heart of this boom were practical, targeted policies. The government began granting state-owned enterprises, SOEs, greater autonomy, though these companies still had to meet production quotas set by Beijing. They were now free to sell goods and services on the open market and more flexible prices. Another major breakthrough was Deng's creation of special economic zones, SEZs, areas where both domestic and foreign businesses enjoyed lower taxes, relaxed trade restrictions, and easier access to international investment. These zones became incubators for entrepreneurship, sparking a wave of innovation across China. It was during this golden era that future giants such as Lenovo and Wahaha Group were born. Testing Western ideas, building Chinese success, the SHS functioned like economic laboratories, allowing China to experiment with Western practices such as open bidding, competitive wages, and performance-based rewards. Gradually, these experiments unlocked the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese people, giving individuals more opportunity to participate in the market. Soon, a new generation of young business owners began to emerge, ambitious, adaptable, and ready to reshape the future of their nation. Telecom reform, a cornerstone of China's modern economic transformation. While the government actively encouraged reform, global events also provided powerful inspiration for Chinese entrepreneurs. Among these was the sweeping privatization and deregulation movement led by Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom between 1985 and 1998, turning point that showed how opening markets could spark growth. Privatization as a lifeline for failing state enterprises. By the 1990s, privatization had become a lifeline for China's heavily indebted state-owned enterprises, SOEs, many of which suffered from poor management and inefficiency. Through initial public offerings, IPOs, and the sale of shares to foreign investors, these companies were able to raise new capital and were forced to adopt international accounting standards. This, in turn, drove sweeping improvements in corporate governance and accountability within China's state sector. The first breakthrough, China Telecom, the first major breakthrough, came in the telecommunications industry, with China Telecom taking the lead. Between 1992 and 1996, China invested more than $35 billion into telecom infrastructure. As a result, the number of people with fixed-line telephone connections surged from 11.5 million to 55 million, a massive leap in just a few years. However, despite this rapid expansion, the early phase of the system was not yet profitable. By the late 1990s, heavy infrastructure spending had pushed a national telecom company into financial losses. Following the Western model and beating expectations inspired by Deutsche Telekom's privatization in 1996, China Telecom set out to raise $2 billion through an IPO, but the task was daunting. China's telecom sector was far more complex than Germany's, and analysts estimated that it would take 350 full-time accountants just to understand the company's internal structure. Fortunately, when China Telecom went public in October 1997, the results exceeded all expectations. The IPO raised $4.2 billion, more than double the target, marking a historic success for China's market reforms. Breaking monopolies and igniting competition, China Telecom's success opened the floodgates. Other industries soon followed with their own privatization efforts. As monopolies began to crumble and competition emerged, efficiency and innovation surged. This shift not only revitalized the telecom sector, but also the oil industry reform when China's growth met its harsh reality. The restructuring of China's oil industry revealed that the country's economic rise was anything but smooth. After the stunning success of China Telecom's privatization, there seemed no reason for the Chinese government to stop there. The next logical step was oil, a sector that desperately needed reform. By the end of the 1990s, China's petroleum industry was struggling with inefficiency and stagnation. Despite earlier attempts at modernization, the China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC, was still far behind its Western competitors. An overstaffed giant, one of CNPC's biggest problems was its bloated workforce, following Deng Xiaoping's earlier reforms. Many workers were guaranteed lifetime employment, complete with housing, healthcare, and job security, a legacy of the socialist welfare model. This practice was common across most state-owned enterprises, SOEs, but CNPC was one of the most extreme examples. By 1999, CNPC employed 1.5 million workers, an astonishing figure compared to just 80,000 employees at British Petroleum (BP). Naturally, restructuring such a massive entity would be complex and costly. While privatizing the telecom industry was already challenging, transforming CNPC into a globally competitive company was an entirely different battle. Global headwinds and harsh adjustments. The broader macroeconomic climate added further uncertainty. The Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s had weakened demand for oil, pushing global oil prices to their lowest levels since 1973, when CNPC was finally restructured and introduced to international markets as PetroChina. The transition came at a heavy cost. 2/3 of its workforce was laid off. The goal was to increase profitability and attract global investors. However, the consequences were severe. Most laid-off workers struggled to find new jobs, and the official reasons for their dismissal often felt arbitrary or opaque. This led to waves of protests, both in China and even in the United States, where critics raised concerns about the human cost of China's economic miracle. Banking and education reforms. How China closed the gap with the global market amid sweeping national reforms. One major issue became impossible to ignore in both education and banking. China's institutions were still far from being compatible with the global market. So, how did the government address this gap? Forming the mind, education, and leadership training. In the 1990s, Chinese universities were producing brilliant engineers, but when it came to training leaders and business managers, they lagged far behind the West. China's premier at the time, Zhu Rongji, recognized this shortfall and turned his attention to one of China's most prestigious schools, Tsinghua University. Often called the MIT of China, he invited the author, Henry M. Paulson Jr., to assess the school's business education program and help design a new, globally competitive curriculum. For Paulson, there were no absolute right or wrong answers in management. What mattered most was the ability to think flexibly, to adapt, analyze, and make sound decisions under uncertainty. Embedding this mindset became the guiding principle of the new program. The reforms shifted focus from theoretical research to practical application. In 2001, Tsinghua launched its groundbreaking course, Management in the Internet Era. Since then, more than 50,000 professionals have participated in Tsinghua's management programs. It's helping shape a generation of globally minded Chinese leaders, reforming the system, the banking overhaul at the same time. China's banking sector required fundamental restructuring to align with international markets. The government established 4 major state-owned banks that would compete with each other in experiment, intended to promote efficiency through competition. However, the process was far from smooth, as these banks began issuing unsecured loans to struggling state-owned enterprises, SOEs. Bad debt started piling up rapidly. Soon, non-performing loans became a national concern, while inflation rose, threatening economic stability. Recognizing the danger, the government launched a massive cleanup effort. Through restructuring, recapitalization, and layoffs, China aimed to bring its banks up to global standards. One success story stood out. Within just 6 years, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, eliminated $135 billion worth of bad debt, emerging stronger and more profitable than ever before. A nation rebuilt from within. These transformations in both classrooms and financial institutions reflected China's determination to reinvent itself from the inside out. By investing in both knowledge and capital, China equipped itself not just to compete with the global economy, but to help shape it. The nation's rise was no longer just about factories and exports. It was about ideas, leadership, and the modernization of minds. Political reform, the missing piece in China's pursuit of sustainable growth from the very beginning of dealing with China. It becomes clear that when an economy transforms, an entire nation transforms with it. Today, as one of the world's leading powers, China's influence reaches far beyond its borders, shaping the global economy and geopolitics alike. Yet, beneath the impressive statistics lies a crucial challenge. Economic reform alone is not enough to sustain its growth and stability. China must also undertake political reform, building a governance system capable of adapting to modern realities. The growing debt crisis, a looming threat, one of the most pressing concerns, is China's mounting debt problem. If left unresolved, it could trigger not only a national downturn, but also a global economic shock. Between 2008 and 2014, China's total debt soared from 130% to 206% of GDP, rising far faster than the economy itself. This imbalance, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) warned in April 2014, was a recipe for a potential financial crisis unless Beijing could rein in domestic credit expansion. Empowering enterprises, reducing political interference to address these vulnerabilities. China must go beyond fiscal tightening. It needs structural reform, especially greater autonomy for state-owned enterprises, SOEs. For decades, the Communist Party has maintained direct control over executive appointments and dismissals within SOEs. This political oversight has often constrained efficiency and discouraged accountability. To compete globally and manage debt effectively, the government must loosen its grip, allowing enterprises to make independent decisions based on performance rather than politics. Only then can China foster the innovation and competitiveness required for long-term sustainability. The environmental reckoning. China's environmental crisis poses another existential challenge. According to multiple reports, air pollution in Beijing has long exceeded the limits set by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. Meanwhile, northern groundwater reserves are running dry, and river and lake systems are so contaminated that many are unsafe for human consumption. Environmental degradation is not merely a side effect of growth. It is a warning sign that unchecked industrialization has a cost. To reverse this trend, China must invest heavily in clean energy and sustainable technology. However, this effort will require time, resources, and crucially, international cooperation. The United States and other developed nations can play a key role in sharing expertise and supporting this green transformation. The Paulson Institute, building bridges for a sustainable future to advance this mission. Henry M. Paulson Jr. founded the Paulson Institute, dedicated to promoting sustainable development in China and fostering collaboration between the two nations. The Institute has launched training programs for Chinese provincial officials, helping them explore urban sustainability strategies. It has also supported the creation of biodiversity mapping projects in China. Wetland regions, vital for protecting fragile ecosystems and restoring environmental balance. Through these efforts, Paulson envisions a future in which China's economic success aligns with global stability and environmental stewardship, not at odds with it. Vision for the future. China's rise is one of the most remarkable economic stories of modern times. But its next chapter will depend on whether it can balance growth with governance, power with responsibility, and prosperity with sustainability. Political reform is not a threat to China's progress. It is its logical evolution. For China to secure its legacy as a global leader, it must now learn not only how to build wealth, but how to preserve it wisely. Effective communication, strengthening the U.S.-China relationship in any relationship. Open communication is essential for solving complex problems. This is even more true when the relationship in question involves two global superpowers. Yet, In the early 2000s, dialogue between the United States and China was often unstable, inconsistent, and easily misunderstood. So how did the two nations bridge this gap? The birth of the Strategic Economic Dialogue, SE, in 2006, as President George W. Bush and Chinese President Hu Jintao agreed to launch a new initiative, the Strategic Economic Dialogue, SED. The goal was clear: to create a helivial, consistent channel of communication focused on improving economic cooperation between the two countries. Before the SED, Chinese officials would meet with different members of the U.S. cabinet separately. The problem was that each department had its own priorities and perspectives, leading to mixed and sometimes contradictory messages. To fix this, President Bush created a new coordinating position to unify America's message, and he appointed Henry M. Paulson Jr., the author of Dealing with China, to lead it. A turning point in U.S.-China dialogue, the first Strategic Economic Dialogue took place in Beijing. On December 14th to 15th, 2006, the meetings proved highly productive and marked a new beginning in bilateral relations. China agreed to allow both the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, to establish representative offices in China, a major step toward integrating its financial markets with the global economy. Additionally, both sides resumed long-stalled negotiations on expanding commercial air routes, signaling renewed trust and cooperation. A sensitive but necessary partnership. Trade between the U.S. and China has always been a sensitive and strategic issue, one that influences global markets and politics alike. The launch of the SED represented not just a diplomatic success, but also a recognition that effective communication is the foundation of stability between two nations whose futures are deeply intertwined. This initiative didn't solve every problem, but it built mutual understanding, encouraged transparency, and laid the groundwork for more constructive engagement in the years to come. Why the U.S. and China must work together on global challenges. Most of us know that the U.S.-China relationship has been strategically significant for decades, dating back to the 1970s. But what was the foundation of that relationship? In truth, it began with mutual needs. Americans were drawn to China's affordable consumer goods, and China was ready to supply them. Today, as China has risen to become a global economic superpower, many Americans have begun to ask, why should we help our biggest competitor? The answer, as Henry M. Paulson explains, is both simple and profound, because China's problems are global problems, and ignoring them ultimately harms everyone, including the United States. Shared challenges require shared solutions. Environmental research by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, 2014, found that nearly 1/4 of sulfate pollution on the U.S. West Coast originated from Chinese factories. In other words, the air we breathe and the climate we share are deeply interconnected. Helping China build a cleaner, more sustainable economy should not be viewed as charity. It's a strategic investment in global stability. Mutual investment, mutual benefit, deeper economic ties can benefit both nations. When American companies invest in China, Chinese investors often reciprocate. Between 2012 and 2013, China invested over $14 billion in various sectors across the U.S., from agriculture to real estate. Although many Americans feel uneasy about foreign ownership, these investments have created jobs and revived struggling industries. Take Wangshan Group, China's largest auto parts manufacturer, as an example, with annual revenues of $23.5 billion. Wangshan employs nearly 6,000 Americans across 14 U.S. states. During the financial crisis, the company acquired several failing auto parts manufacturers, saving over 3,500 American jobs in the process. Looking ahead, cooperation over confrontation. The future of the U.S.-China relationship will shape the future of the world. While rivalry will always exist, collaboration brings far greater rewards. Whether tackling climate change, trade reform, or global security, the two nations must recognize that their fates are intertwined. In the long run, cooperation will yield far more than competition ever could. At the end of the 20th century, China was a poor, developed country, struggling to find its place in the modern world. Few could have imagined that, through bold reform, relentless learning, and an openness to global ideas, China would achieve one of the most spectacular economic transformations in history. In just a few decades, it rose from poverty to power, from isolation to influence. This journey holds lessons for every developing nation, including Vietnam, that progress begins with openness, reform, and the courage to adapt. Only through learning, cooperation, and innovation can we truly stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's great powers. Reading Dealing with China is like walking through the inner corridors of one of the world's most complex and misunderstood relationships between the United States and China. Henry Paulson does not just present data or policy debates. He opens a window into how trust, communication, and vision shape the fate of nations. What struck me most about this book is its honesty. Paulson does not romanticize China's success, nor does he demonize it. Instead, he shows us how a nation, once broken by poverty and isolation, rebuilt itself through reform, discipline, and the willingness to learn, even from its rivals. That humility, that relentless drive to improve, is perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. The book also reveals that progress always has a price. Behind China's glittering skyscrapers and rapid modernization lies a history of sacrifice and imbalance. Millions of workers laid off, polluted cities, and a constant tension between growth and governance. Paulson forces us to confront a hard truth. Economic development without political reform and sustainability will always reach a breaking point. At the same time, his message is hopeful. He reminds readers that cooperation between nations is not a weakness, it's a necessity. When the US and China choose dialogue over confrontation, the world becomes safer, cleaner, and more prosperous. Their destinies are intertwined, and so are ours. On a personal level, dealing with China taught me that leadership, whether in business, government, or life, is not about control, but about connection. TID is about listening, understanding, and building bridges where others see walls. That is the true art of diplomacy, and, perhaps, the true art of progress. Paulson's story is more than an economic chronicle. It is a reflection on human ambition, cooperation, and courage. It makes us ask if China could reinvent itself through openness and reform. What could we achieve if we approached our own challenges with the same determination?